I think board games are a really unique kind of way to interact with other people and to play, because with video games, a lot of times we're playing video games by ourselves. Maybe we're playing online with friends, but we're typically sitting in a room by ourselves and playing. Whereas with a board game, it's very interactive. You really can't play board games without sitting down across the table from other people. So I think that the community element is really strong. It's a very relational hobby because, again, you can't really play by yourself. So I appreciate that. And I also think that, like, as the world gets more and more digital, it's kind of refreshing to have a hobby and activity that's actually physical, that we're using our hands and we're moving things around and using our bodies and using our mind in a way that isn't just purely digital. So I really appreciate that about board games. It's one of the reasons I love them so much.
In this video, I interview my friend Mondo Davis, and he is a board game designer. I was blown away by the things that I learned about board games and why they matter. If you like learning new things, go ahead and click like and subscribe so more people can see this video. It's an amazing interview. I hope you enjoy it. The first questions our students want to ask you is, how did you get into board game design?
Yeah, actually, I started designing board games because there is a computer game that I used to play as a kid called Escape Velocity, which I played on an old system. It doesn't exist anymore, on an old computer system. So I set out to try and make a board game version of it. That was my first attempt, and I learned a lot along the way. The game itself was not very good, but the process was really great because I learned kind of what it meant to make a board game, and I haven't looked back. That was about 8 years ago.
Are you a full-time board game designer?
I am not. I'm a part-time board game designer. There are not many full-time board game designers in the world, probably about a dozen across the entire world. So it's definitely not very common for there to be full-time board game designers.
All right, so I got to ask this question. Kids want to know, how many followers do you have on TikTok?
I am around 45,000, something like that.
That's impressive. One of the kids said that is lit.
Oh, thank you. So are you.
How many board games have you designed on average, or if you could take a guess?
I've designed a lot. I have 9 that have been signed by publishers that are going to be available in stores. I've got about another 10 right now that I'm trying to find publishers for, and then probably about 30 to 50 that I've designed during my time as a designer and haven't finished yet. They haven't gone anywhere. So whatever that is, probably around 50 to 60 total over the last 8 years.
What does it mean to have your board game picked up by a publisher?
Yeah, so if you imagine you have a book that somebody writes, and they take the book that they write to a publishing company, and the publishing company takes it and they put artwork on it and they edit it and they send it out to all the stores, but they do the whole process of producing it and creating the actual book instead of just what someone's typed up on a computer. It's kind of the same thing in board games. So I'll give my what's called a prototype, which is just a version of the game that I made myself, which is usually handwritten stuff. It's not very professionally done, but they'll take that and then they'll find an artist for it and they'll manufacture all the pieces and they'll ship it worldwide to all the different stores that are going to sell it. And then my name will be on the box, but I'm not the one that is doing any of that kind of manufacturing and production stuff, which is really convenient for me.
Why do board games matter as opposed to why not just play video games the whole time?
Yeah, I mean, I think board games are a really unique kind of way to interact with other people and to play, because with video games, a lot of times we're playing video games by ourselves. Maybe we're playing online with friends, but we're typically sitting in a room by ourselves and playing. Whereas with a board game, it's very interactive. You really can't play board games without sitting down across the table from other people. So I think that the community element is really strong. It's a very relational hobby because, again, you can't really play by yourself. So I appreciate that. And I also think that, as the world gets more and more digital, it's kind of refreshing to have a hobby and activity that's actually physical, that we're using our hands and we're moving things around and using our bodies and using our mind in a way that isn't just purely digital. So I really appreciate that about board games. It's one of the reasons I love them so much.
And this is kind of a similar question, but do you feel that playing board games helps you connect with your family and friends?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think, like I said, so relationships come out of shared experiences. We don't have friends. We don't have, relationships with our family or people that we're close to without doing things together, about experiencing things together. And I think board games are a great medium for that. And I've seen my own relationships with my family are strengthened because we play games together, and the friends that I've made through it are, just strong relationships that I'll have with me for my whole life. So absolutely.
And how many board games did you say were picked up by publishers so far?
9 right now total.
That's amazing. How many board games have you designed that were not picked up by publishers?
Yeah, so like I said, there's about 10 to 12 that I'm currently trying to pitch to publishers. So those that have not been picked up yet. But then there's a long list of games that never got to that stage, either because they just weren't that good, or I pitched them and nobody wanted them, or whatever the case may be. So it's a long list, but I would imagine it's probably in the 30 to 40 range.
So that's something we're learning as young adults. A lot of my students are learning that you might have more failures than you have wins, and those aren't necessarily failures either. It just might be a matter of preference. You might have a great board game, but that doesn't mean everyone will like it.
Right. And I think the process of making something and having it fail in that sense is you're still developing the skills, you're still practicing the process of creating something, whether it's board games or anything else. So there really is no failure to it, just because you're going to walk away a better creator, a better designer than you were when you started. So that's that it serves that function at the very least, even if it doesn't end up getting sold, in a store.
As you know, my students are making their own board games. That's why we're interviewing you. They want to know, do short board games or long and complicated board games tend to be more popular?
Well, it's all about the audience, right? Because there's a market of there's people like me that really love complicated, longer board games. Those people typically aren't drawn to shorter, simpler games as much. But there's also a lot of people that are a lot more casual in the way they play games and enjoy things that are quick and easy to learn, and don't take up too much time. So depending on the audience, I think there's a lot more people that like short, simple games than there are people that like kind of longer, complicated games. So if we're talking just purely popularity, or like how many copies are going to get sold, then it's it would be the shorter, simpler games for sure.
Now, you design board games. Would you say you're good at playing them?
No. When you design a game, and it's probably true with anything that you create, you kind of learn a lot about what's going on behind the scenes. So I am able to see through some of the surface things and the themes and the artwork and all that to really understand the systems that are in place, maybe more quickly than someone that isn't as familiar with games. But that doesn't mean that I'm good at them. It just means that I can kind of figure them out more quickly than I would if I wasn't as familiar with them.
Have you ever been beat in a board game you designed?
Oh, all the time. It's a joke among designers that whenever you pitch a game to a publisher, meaning I show them my prototype, and in case they want to buy it from me, you always let the publisher win, because they'll enjoy the game a lot more if they win. You got to make sure that the publisher wins when you pitch a game. So they beat me every time.
Our sixth graders are designing a Moses board game project that's going to show the setbacks, so all the failures Moses experienced, and all the power-ups, all the blessings and favor that he experienced in his journey with God. So there's a situation where the Israelites complained and didn't want to follow Moses, so that could be 3 steps back. There's a situation where God sees Moses in a burning bush. That could be 5 steps forward, because that's a call to action. Before we talk about our board games, can you show us some board games you've made? Do you happen to have any with you?
Well, I do have a copy of a game that I'm working on. I could show you. I'm at work. I'm not at home right now, so I don't have my games with me, but I do bring this to work. So I'm making this game about you're creating a blanket, and you are just putting cards down on the table to try and make different shapes. So if you think about Tetris shapes, you can see you've got the green spaces make that little L shape, like the piece from Tetris, if y'all are familiar with Tetris.
I see that.
Yeah, so you put the cards down on the table, you're trying to make specific shapes, and you score points if you can make them. So that's just a really simple card game that I'm working on that is pretty new, actually. It hasn't really been played much yet. So there you go. There's one. I can send you a link to some of the games that I have that are in the publishing pipeline that have artwork and everything as well, if you're interested. But that's all I have with me right now.
What is a strategy for working on a board game with someone else? A lot of these kids are designing board games with either 1 or 2 friends. And I know some of the board games you've created with partners. So what's the strategy to that?
So there's a lot that goes into making a board game. So it's nice to be able to divide up the work. One person might be responsible for one part of it, and another person might be responsible for another part of it. That's a good way to do it. I know for me, usually when I work with somebody, one of us is the one that makes the actual prototype and makes changes to the prototype, and the other one is the person that takes it and has other people play it and gets their feedback and then reports back. So it's kind of a partnership that works out that way, so that I'm only doing one part of that and someone else is doing another part of that. So in your context, I think I was looking through the project, it seems like there's a handful of different steps to it. So it would probably be pretty great for one person to work on one of the steps and another person to work on another, so you can kind of piece it all together as a team.
And one thing I'm trying to communicate to my students is
the project is due February 27th. They've been told constantly if they finish early, they need to design and make their project better or their board game better. How many times have you finished a board game and then played it and then realized, oh, I need to add this rule or I need to do this, which will make it more fun?
I mean, every single time. Usually what happens is I'll make a version that like I believe will work and will be playable, and then I will let other people play it, and then I'll take their feedback and change things about it, and that'll happen 10, 20, 50 times before the game's finished, which finished is kind of funny because even if I take a game to a publisher and they sign it and they want to make it, it'll still go through a process where it gets played a lot and will continue to develop. So there's really no real point when the game is completely finished until someone can buy it on a shelf. So that is the whole process, is thinking that you have something and trying it out and finding out that it needs work and then fixing it and continually fixing it and fixing it and fixing it until it gets better and better and better.
Here's a kind of different question, but I think most people would say Monopoly is one of the most popular games in the world. I wouldn't say that's my favorite game, though. Why do you think Monopoly has become so popular? Was it marketing? Is it a great game design or a story?
I think it has a lot of staying power because it was the game that everybody grew up with. Like our parents grew up playing it. Their parents grew up familiar with it, at least. So I think that because of that, it just gets passed on generationally, and families that maybe don't play a lot of games together, if they do play a game together, they just grab the game that everybody knows and everybody understands. And that could be Monopoly or Battleship or Sorry or some of those other, very common popular games. So I think that Monopoly is great for the game that it is. I think that if I were to I would have a lot of changes I would make to it. If they gave me the green light to change it, I think that people that love it, and it's great for that.
I'm so happy to hear you say that. So we can all agree Monopoly is a great game. Whoever invented it or the publisher, they're still making lots and lots of money off of it. But I agree with Mr. Davis that it could be better. Would you be willing to share some of the design changes you would make to Monopoly? Or is that top secret?
It's just my opinion, so I can share. I think that I don't want to get too technical or get into too much detail here because that might be interesting. But the thing that makes a game good is the decisions that you get to make. If you have interesting decisions that you get to make on your turn, the game itself is interesting. A game like Monopoly where you roll dice and you move what it says and whatever happens to you, there's not a lot of really interesting, exciting decisions in that process. Whether or not you buy a property is a decision, but it's also like you have to have the right amount of money, and that isn't always the case, and that sort of thing. So I think that would be the focus, is like, how do we make the turns more interesting by giving players different decisions about how to use their turn? That would be my focus. And again, I could go into a lot of detail on that, but that's the quick answer.
That's really good. So with a lot of these board games, some of my students have like a Jenga type style game. You're allowed to take different popular board games and fuse them to make them your own. It might be a Jenga combined with Monopoly or Candyland combined with chess or something. But I just heard you say decisions. And so Moses should be able to choose, am I going to go in this direction or this direction? Is there a board game we have heard of that has a lot of decisions in it?
Chess is a good example because you have so many pieces that you can do so many things with. So yeah, there's a lot of choices in chess. I think that's a great example. As far as if anyone is familiar with Catan, that's a good example because there are different things that you can do on your turn. You don't have to do the same thing every time. So that's an example of a game where you do have decisions. Because most of the games that I'm thinking of that you've mentioned, like Battleship. Battleship's a good example because you're getting to choose the plot point that you want to check.
Have you always liked board games, or is that something that grew on you?
I grew up playing board games. I played a lot of Risk, and I played Monopoly and those types of games. The games that I enjoy now are considered, they're called, modern board games. That's kind of the general term for them. And most of them have been made since like 2015 or so. So they're, less than 10 years old, a lot of them. So I didn't start playing those games until I started designing games, which was 8 years ago. So once I started doing that and getting into that, I got really into it and have really loved board games for that amount of time. And before that, again, it was, I liked them, but it wasn't something I would consider like a consistent hobby that I had.
I imagine a lot of my students are excited about this Moses board game project, and a lot of them are smiling. I know some of them might be a little more hesitant or reluctant. What would you say to someone who's more hesitant about board games, or they just haven't found it as a joyful experience yet?
Well, that's perfectly valid. Not everybody likes board games, and not everybody has to like board games. But I do think that there's so many great board games that are out there that I truly believe that there is a board game for everybody, and that every type of person, the ways their mind works, or the things that they're interested, or whatever the case may be, like there is a board game that they will enjoy. So I think a lot of times that kind of hesitancy of getting into board games, maybe you've played one and haven't had a good experience, that's really common. But I think that finding the right game is a really important step. So there's, lots of opportunities to do that. But I recommend trying different games out that you haven't played, and hopefully finding one that really sticks with you, that you really enjoy.
I know that you read our project. The type of project we're doing is called design thinking, where kind of like how you're saying decisions are important. This is a project that's very open-ended. Kids can make lots of decisions. I know some kids are going to have dice in their game. Some kids will have cards where it'll say, Pharaoh changed his mind, move back 2 spaces. Are you able to, just off the top of your head, let's say you are one of my students, would you be able to just off the top of your head say some elements you would have in your Moses board game?
That's a good question. I tend to make very card-focused games. That's kind of where I gravitate towards. So my first step would be to find a game that already exists, and it sounds kind of like what you guys are doing, and find one that feels similar to Moses' journey, whether that's you're traveling from point A to point B, or you're encountering different challenges that come up and you have to deal with them. I'd find a game like that and see how I can take those mechanics and ideas that are in that game and repurpose them into the theme that we're working with, which would be Moses. Well, I'm trying to think of some off the top of my head, but games like Pandemic is one that's fairly popular, but that's a game where everybody's working together to deal with problems as they come up. So a game like that would be good because you'd be able to incorporate those challenges or those power-ups or things that you mentioned into like a game where everybody's working together to try to solve them. That would be my first step, is thinking through that and trying to find a game that matches the same feeling, and then trying to repurpose it and retheme it with what we're working with.
This is awesome. And, we want to be really respectful of your time. What other pieces of advice would you give to these 6th graders they're about 50% done with their projects? How many times do you think they should test out the game and play through it? Like play through design. I mean, ideally you do that as many times as you can. Like I said, I think that a game can always get better, but my advice would be to really pay attention to people's reactions to your game. If people seem bored, or they seem stressed, or they seem whatever, like whatever their emotional state is when the game is being played, is something that you really want to try and pay attention to, because the feedback that they'll give you might be helpful and it might not. But if you can kind of tune into what they're feeling, or even ask them directly, but if you can understand what they're feeling when the different parts of the game are happening, you'll be able to understand what is interesting and what isn't interesting, and what is too hard and what is too easy and stuff like that. And then go back and try and change those things to get the emotion that you're looking for. Every board game elicits some type of emotion. That's a big focus of design. So being able to understand what your playtesters are feeling and reacting to it, I think is a really great approach. That's good. And I like how you talked about how you want games to not be too easy and not be too hard, but you want to find that sweet spot. And so we're actually 6th graders designing games, and our target audience is 12th graders, which is pretty interesting. Yeah. So most of the board games you design, Mr. Davis, how long does it take you to design them?
I mean, the whole process, like from the point that I start to the point that I sign a contract with a publisher, it could be 6 months, it could be a year, it could be 2 years. I mean, I have some games that I'm pitching that I've had for over a year, so it's a very long process to do the way that I'm doing it. As far as like how long does it take from my idea to when I can have it play tested, or like when I have a copy that people can play, that's usually immediate. Usually I don't spend too much time coming up with ideas. I come up with an idea and I immediately try to make a copy of it that can be played, and then I try to get it played as quickly as possible, because you don't know how good your game is until someone plays it. It might seem like the best game in the world in your head or even on paper, but as soon as someone else plays it, you can see what is wrong with it and what's good about it, and go from there. So that's always a very quick process.
Do I have any students that want to ask a question now that you've met Mr. Davis? I have a student who said, have you published any games that they might have heard of?
So the games that I've published or that I've signed are not available in stores yet. The first one is going to be available on March 1st. It's a party game called Mansplaining. It'll be available on Amazon and in like game stores, but otherwise, no. None of the games that I have signed are out available yet. So hopefully someday they'll be popular enough to where everybody will have heard of them, but not yet.
And students, I want to say it's very likely. I've seen my friend Mondo in his growth as a board game designer, and I would not be surprised if my kids grow up playing his games, or y'all start playing them in the future too. One day in the future, you might say, wow, I actually met the guy who designed this game, and it's very popular. So I have a student who wants to know, like, how do you feel about the difference between board games and video games?
Yeah, I mean, like I said earlier, I think that board games are very communicative and very community and relationship focused because they're physical and you're at a table with other people. So I appreciate that about board games. And I know that happens in video games, but I think it's just different having a tactile in-person experience with your friends and family. Like, I really cherish that about board games.
One student wants to know, how much does a new board game designer make off of board games that get published?
When I sign a contract, there's an agreed upon percentage that I get of every copy that sells. So usually that's somewhere from 7 to 10%. So for my first game, Mansplaining, I'm going to make 60 cents off of every copy that is sold. So if, you sell 100,000 copies, then that's $60,000. But typically it's like, I can expect to sell about 2,000 to 3,000 copies initially. So 60% of that is what I would make. But usually the money's not great. That's going to probably always be true. But I do it because I love it.
And that's great. Yeah, that was another question I had a student have is, do you do it for the money or because you love board games?
Yeah, no, there's not a lot of money in board games, so I do it for the love of it.
How do you come up with your ideas for board games?
So I usually start with the actual mechanics of the game. So like what players do on their turns. That's what I try to design that. Rolling dice and doing something with the dice or playing cards in a certain way, and then come up with ideas for how those turn things. What kind of theme, what ideas, stories that I can tell with that. And usually I lean on my own experiences. Like I make games about places I've traveled to or memories I have as a kid or things like that. Usually games that I make come out of that, my own personal experience and things that I've seen and done.
So I also like how you are working your full-time job, right? You're using your full-time job to help pay for resources for your family. And then your part-time job is more so your hobby. And I think that's really cool that sixth graders can see there are a lot of options career-wise.
Yeah, definitely.
You're not limited to just one career, but you can, often do a career and a hobby, and that might turn into a job later. One student wants to know, what is your full-time job?
I'm a teacher, actually. I teach at a high school in Atlanta.
Okay, cool. What subject?
I teach English as a second language to students that are learning English for the first time.
I have a student who asks, would you ever want to make a game that incorporates food?
A game about food or a game where you eat the parts of the game? I think it'd be really hard. It'd be hard to make a game with edible components just from a manufacturing standpoint, but making games that are themed about food, I love that. I've actually got at least one. That ice cream game you mentioned is about food, so that's a fun topic to make games about.
Mr. Davis, it looks like those are all the questions we have. Any closing thoughts?
No, I think it's fun you guys are doing this. I'm really glad I was able to come and hopefully say some interesting worthwhile things about making board games. I really do encourage all y'all to check out the board games that are out there. It's a really fun medium and a great way to spend time with friends and learn and grow. Happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, thank you. And we look forward to playing your games in the future. Oh, Mr. King has a question. If you were stranded on an island and could have only one board game, what would it be?
If I was stranded by myself, I would have a solo game, a game you can play by yourself, which they do exist. There's one called Crystallo, that is probably my favorite. I'd probably have a deck of cards because there's so many games you could play with a deck of cards. So that'd probably be my answer. It's a boring answer, but
gotcha. I would have picked the biggest board game possible so it has resources that I could
That's fair.
use to burn for food or
something
away.
Build a fire with.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to your future games.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Thanks everybody for having me.